script, and you come in your gorgeous Persian attire, and we put on a fabulous production, sort of. And so let me know please, if you want to participate. As I say, no rehearsals, you get a script, there's songs you know, and you can find me, I don't know, on email at blbink@aol.com. If anyone wants to contact me by email or talk to me here or whatever. Okay, that's all for me. Very enthusiastic response.
We're taking it in.
My name is Fran Teflitz. I'm on the Adult Ed Committee of Kehila. And just wanted all three of our communities to know that on March 8th, we're gearing up for Passover. This is the session where we have demonstrations and tastings and recipes of Hasidic foods. So we'll have haroset, we'll teach you how to make matzah, we'll teach you how to make homemade horseradish, a Passover dessert. What else? Oh, and we have an entree. So if you're trying to think of, what can I do to jazz up my Seder meal, be sure to come to that. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everybody, I'm Seth Garland. I'm the president of Beth Chi. Just want to announce, you might see the board over there. Beth Chi is hosting its annual auction on March 7th in the evening. That's a Saturday. We're changing it up a little this year, and we're doing it as a potluck member mixer too, and everybody is invited, everybody from Kehila, Car, etc. to join us. So it's Saturday, March 7th from 6 to 8, and we're doing it in the Whitehall Community Room, which is in Bethesda. We will be putting the information in everybody's newsletters, but everybody's welcome to join for a fun potluck evening.
And I'll add for Mahar, because I heard all the fundraisers. Mahar's doing a coffee house that's I don't know all the details, but I think it's in the Mahar newsletter. So I think that's next month, I think. Oh, yeah, Kenny. I don't know. Yeah, maybe we should start doing more of that. Joyce Rosenthal's the organizer of the coffee house. So. Oh, great.
March 14th, Saturday night. I'm supposed to say this at the Silver Spring Civic Building, and it's a really fun. It's a talent show and coffee house. And I know that Dory and Steve are going to be singing, and other people in the fun choirs going to be singing, and there's lots of good music. So they shouldn't put the location in the newsletter. Yeah, the location isn't in the newsletter, but so that's March 14th, Saturday night. It's really fun.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Next month, March 22nd, the next adult ed that Toby and I put together is on Jewish summer camps. And the speaker is from Habonim Dror, if anyone knows Camp Moshava. Someone back there knows, okay. And I know some people here have kids that went there. So that's a camp north of Baltimore with a long Jewish history. And so they'll be talking about that. But then we're also going to have it be a discussion for people of all ages, because maybe you all went to summer camps back in the day. I know I did back in the 80s. And then there's a whole history of Jewish summer camps. And so we'll take the microphone around and people can talk about the history of Jewish summer camps too, and they're involved. So I think that'll be fun. Okay, so I think with that, we'll go to today's program. Our guest is David Abramson, longtime Mahar member. He was also chair of the Adult Ed Committee when Toby and I joined the Adult Ed Committee, so he helped us get to where we are today. So it's sort of, we always look up to him, and when we have questions, we go to David. So David's professional background, I don't have the whole resume here, but he worked for the State Department for many years and was a Russian-Ukrainian expert. And so the topic is on the Putin's war in Ukraine annual update. We've done this, I think, 3 times now. So we'd love to not have to do it every year, but we're still doing it as long as that war keeps going on. It's good for us to know because it gets bumped off the headlines by all the other craziness, but it's still happening and it's very important. And in some ways, what I read, you can tell us if this is true, it might be like the next phase of war like the way drones and AI and technology and the internet are being used. I don't know if that's happened in warfare the way it is there. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So anyway, I'll invite David up and then we'll do Q&A afterwards, and looking forward to hearing. So thanks, David. Thanks for coming.
Hello, everybody. I too am, it is unfortunate that this is the 4th annual Russia-Ukraine talk that I'm giving, but I'm grateful to Mahar for inviting me to come back. I guess what I wanted to start with is a very brief refresher of what I said last year. I'm sure not all of you were here. For others who were here, it'd be a reminder of how some things haven't changed, and then do a little comparison with what's happened over the last year. So, you know, the war has lasted for almost 4 years. 2 days from now, it'll be the 4th anniversary. Yeah. And what I said last year was, a year ago, Russia was never prepared to fight a country the size of Ukraine. They expected a victory within 3 days, some say within just 2 or 3 weeks. What wasn't anticipated was the low level of preparation on the part of Russia, the Western unity and support that was unexpectedly strong, enduring, and critical. And I'll just do a little footnote here. It continues to be, with a certain large exception, but that's also nuanced. And then Ukrainian resistance also exceeded expectations. And I'll talk a little bit about why. The prospects, what are the prospects for an end to the war? I said last year that it won't be soon, and I say that today as well. Putin has proven to be uncompromising in terms of he's willing to negotiate, willing to talk, but not really negotiate in good faith. That hasn't changed. He still has insisted that Ukraine be whatever is left of Ukraine, that it be neutral, and that it not be a member of NATO, that it be demilitarized, that Russia keeps occupied territory, and actually more than what it currently occupies. The regions of the 4 regions that it has taken since the start of the expanded military invasion 4 years ago, plus Crimea. They haven't emphasized as much denazification in the last year, but they were emphasizing that yesterday, which I always read as just code for leadership change, that they would only tolerate removing the Jewish Nazi presidents in charge of leading Ukraine and others in the leadership. And then that Russia maintain a veto over any security guarantees and military aid to Ukraine. So that doesn't leave much room for sovereignty. I said all that a year ago. Pretty much all of that has remained in place. All of it has remained in place. And we'll talk about all the shuttle diplomacy and talks that are going on and pretty much spinning their wheels and aren't likely to lead anywhere. Why do I think Putin will keep fighting until he subjugates Ukraine? And by subjugation, I mean basically turn it into a client state, a puppet state like Belarus. Is this merely a negotiating ploy before compromising, staking a position which he might back off of? We've seen no evidence that he's willing to back off of any of his claims and goals with regard to Ukraine, whether Russia is doing well or poorly in the war at any time. There's been no shift in those positions. Russia has only redoubled its efforts, even when it was losing at different points, especially including in the summer of 2022, earlier on, when they, after gaining a lot of territory, then they lost a lot to Ukraine. And now, even more than last year, too much has been invested in the war, turning Russia increasingly into a wartime economy that is very difficult, would be difficult in terms of the regime security at home, domestically, to back away from. I'm not saying that it couldn't be managed if they had to, if Putin decided they needed to, but the number of elites and industries that have gone into supporting the war make it really difficult and counterproductive from a domestic political perspective to back off of that. So a year ago, I noted that Russia was advancing territorially in Ukraine, but I did ask, but at what cost? At that time, I noted that in all of 2024, so we're talking about the year before last, Russia took 4,000 square kilometers of land, equivalent to the state of Rhode Island, in 3 years, which is 0.67%, less than 0.2% of Ukrainian territories. And none of that included cities. I also noted that Russian casualty estimates to date at that time were more than 800,000 killed and wounded. About 150,000 killed in 3 years, which is more than twice US losses in Vietnam in 10 years, and more than 10 times Soviet losses in Afghanistan in 10 years. The economic impact, I noted, were labor shortages, especially in non-military sectors, and including agriculture, debt, private debt, and dwindling reserves. And I also noted that it was expected that in 2025, so I was speaking at the very beginning of 2025, that Russian arms stocks were running out. Those stocks, the war has changed, and as Mike mentioned, drone warfare has developed in ways that make human, like soldiers, and the use of other aspects of conventional military warfare less important. Roughly 70% of battle casualties are from drones on both sides. But Ukrainian casualties are about half of Russian casualties. So 1/3 of the close to 2 million overall casualties from this war. Now, looking a year later at February 2026, according to some studies, in 2022, when Russia first started an expanded invasion, they had taken 26% of Ukrainian territory, and that's not talking about Crimea. But losses since then brought it down to just 17%. And Russia has since gained the equivalent of 20% of Ukrainian territory. This is after 4 years of war. Russian ground advances now are averaging 15 to 17 meters a day. A lot of this has to do with the nature of the fighting through drone warfare. You cannot advance with drones and take territory with drones alone. You need humans, you need armored vehicles and everything to back that up to secure the territory that you take. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult for them to advance. And also why they're pushing to negotiate land that they have never been able to take, which the idea is that they can take land that includes this long Maginot Line-like defense system that the Ukrainians have built. And after that, there's open land, so the Ukrainians are never going to accept that because they don't believe that Russia would stop, maybe temporarily, but they would continue. Casualties declined last year, but they're increasing again, and we're seeing 30 to 35,000 casualties a month. And by casualties, I mean killed and wounded, and killed and wounded. And this is because they don't have enough, transportation and protection, and they're just sending Russians in on, motorbikes and bicycles to try to as well as using drones to try to take these 15 to 17 meters a day. And what isn't noted as much is that Ukrainians have also taken back some land recently that the Russians had captured. So it's not all one way. Generally, it's incremental advances for Russia. In terms of the economy, inflation is going up significantly. The regions, which are all required, of the various regions around Russia, are required to keep coming up with 30,000 conscripts a month to make up for those losses. The signing bonuses have now gone beyond what they can afford. And so they're asking for more money from the center. The center has less money. The center has also put pressure on private banks to loan to the military industrial complex so they could keep making the artillery shells, et cetera. So that's drawing down on those resources as well. And these private banks there could be some major economic crisis of debt crisis. They've managed all of this to date, so I'm not predicting that such a crisis would happen tomorrow or even a year from now. I just don't know. But the pressure on the system over time is greater and greater. Sanctions are continuing. Sanctions against Shadow Fleet, the sort of unflagged Russian vessels that Russia uses to export its oil around the world, gradually are increasing. The EU and European countries individually are also imposing their own and understanding that they can't rely on or coordinate with Russia, with the US in the same way that they could before. So let me turn to what has changed since on the part of the US, the Trump administration. Now, I retired from the State Department this past fall, so I no longer am required to offer this caveat in advance saying that whatever I say does not represent the views of the government. It doesn't, but I can be much more flexible than I had been in the past, although I tried to be quite flexible anyway, noting that these were my personal views. So when it comes to the Q&A in our discussion, have at it. So why has there been so much activity and no results? The Trump factor over the past year hasn't shifted the equation in the Russia-Ukraine war, despite Trump promising to end it in 24 hours. Of course, nobody believed that. Well, I didn't. And then it continues, and we keep seeing, it's like Groundhog Day. It's the same, just more negotiations, even though we keep hearing that they are this close. It's just one issue that's troublesome issue, land, territory. Small issue that they're still working through. But this happens over and over and over again. The people that the administration has put in charge are not people from the State Department, are not our diplomats. There's Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Now, I assume that after all this time that they must have sort of burnished some of their diplomatic skills and credentials. I don't know, I'm not in the room. What I did know is that Witkoff, who's been doing this from the beginning of the administration, was not reading the analysis that we were producing or the reporting on which it was based. What does that tell me? It tells me that Trump wants some deal. He doesn't care at whose expense, especially Ukraine's. I think he probably sees the world in terms of great powers and spheres of influence on the one hand, but I think that's not his only his motivation. He clearly, based on his claims of having resolved 7 or 8 or more wars and conflicts, it suggests to me that he wants a significant conflict resolved one way or another, or to be seen as resolved so that he can get the credit for it. So he sends people out for these negotiations. Witkoff, by the way, his primary negotiator on the war has never been to Kyiv. He's been to Moscow at least 5 or 6 times. Just putting that out there. I would also say that this is my view, that his focus on himself needing to be at the center of this and to get credit, the delight in spectacle, summits, leadership meetings in the case of the war, and his transactional approach to everything, which was cultivated over many years in the context of business and real estate, that those 3 things do not always work together. And each one might not be appropriate, or all 3 of them might not be appropriate in this context, but that's how he operates. And so the people he sends out, his representatives, to the extent that they understand that, and I think they do pretty well, they need to feed those motivations on his part and tell him what they think he wants to hear, which is also the way I see Putin's advisors, and have actually seen reporting demonstrating that, and I think this is just a common pattern within authoritarian states. You don't want to tell the leader bad news, or you don't want to be the one to tell the leader, give the leader the bad news. But you have to find ways to work around that in order to keep things moving forward. So why would Putin or Zelensky agree to anything that Trump promises? Why would we believe anything that Putin promises? If we go back to 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine, in exchange for very vague security guarantees of its sovereignty, gave up nuclear weapons. And then look what happened over time since then. I think both of them believe that time is on their side. In the case of Putin, he believes it's on his on his side, and he sees that the U.S. administration's actions are fueling this. And I think some of this comes from a lot of it is based in decades of believing, look, partly his training in history in the KGB back in the Soviet period that viewed the Soviet Union as, inviolable, and Putin himself has said that that was the greatest disaster of the 20th century, the breakup of the Soviet Union. Zelensky understands that time has to be on their side because it's an existential struggle. There is no future for Ukraine as a sovereign state if they were to give up or cede territory that they believe would lead to make it easier for Russia. And European actors are playing for time, but they're also preparing for a future of the war without being able to rely on the US. And I think Ukraine is also doing that. And I think Ukraine can do that, at least as long as the US is willing to sell arms to whoever is willing to buy them to provide to Ukraine. The US, this administration isn't giving anything anymore, even if it does support local economies around the US through the military industries. But that's not, Ukraine still has, and it has more options than it had at any point in the last 4 years. Now, that's not always clear from what we read in the news, depending on what news we're reading, but a lot of it tends to privilege Russia as this great power still, with all of its vulnerabilities, against a smaller Goliath against a smaller David, if you will. But assuming that David is not necessarily, can't win this fight. Why doesn't Zelensky, why else isn't he willing to negotiate, to cede land? The large majority of Ukrainians are against ceding land and are against surrendering and don't trust Russia. So in terms of domestic politics alone, that's not going to, that's not a winning position. I think they've largely given up on the idea of the prospect that Ukraine will become a NATO member at any point in the near future, but that is not necessary. Ukraine is just looking for security guarantees, but not just security guarantees that the US or Europe or some countries would come to its aid if Russia attacks following some kind of ceasefire. They're trying to create their own to guarantee for themselves. And the development of their own military industrial complex is extremely impressive. They're ahead of the Russians on drone development, although the Russians catch up with them. The Russians can produce a lot more in large quantities because it's centralized, but they have these economic issues. They're both getting components for drone technology from the Chinese, even though Russia and China are the, much closer partners. The Chinese will say that they're not selling weapons to any side, and they're selling all the parts that can be quickly assembled to make weapons, but not the weapons themselves, at least as far as I'm aware. And it's easier to be on the defensive than the offensive. Now you might say, well, what about this the drone attacks have just increased. Ukraine is working on on drone detection and counter drone technology, and it's just a constantly evolving dynamic. But Russian aerial attacks, whether on energy infrastructure in Ukraine or on other civilian infrastructure or elsewhere, that doesn't translate into territorial advances. They don't have the ability to advance. And this is all underlies or contradicts the claim that, or the concern that what if the lines of defense collapse? That hasn't happened in 4 years, and it's very unlikely to happen. Just some more examples of changes or things that we are not aware of, probably, unless you listen to a podcast from the British newspaper, The Telegraph, Ukraine the Latest, which I listen to almost every day. Every 2 weeks, they do an update on Ukrainian violent resistance and other forms of resistance in the occupied territories. And it's probably the equivalent of 1 act of sabotage per day. We don't hear about the occupied territories very much, if ever, but it is going on despite the repression. I mean, they need to do this, and they're doing it, and they're finding ways to do it. There are assassinations, including in Moscow, of senior military intelligence officials, as well as in the occupied territory. And just on the energy front, there were pipelines that would go through the Black Sea to Greece, through Greece and then out, that Russia would export its gas. Now that's being used to import US liquefied natural gas through Greece and the Balkans on pipelines to Ukraine. So they've reversed that, undermining one important exporting pipeline for the Russians and finding ways to get energy into Ukraine. So these are all things that are developing over time, and trying to see it all in a picture that is not as bleak as when is this war going to end suggests. Finally, a few thoughts of the impact of war on geopolitics and the future of war. I'm not an expert on history of war, but as Mike was saying at the beginning in his introduction, we haven't seen a war like this. I mean, some people make comparisons to World War I in terms of how the lines are just largely not moving while there are lots of casualties. And that it's the greatest war in Europe since World War II. Russia's ability to project itself as a great power is diminishing, and has been since the breakup of the Soviet Union. When you look at what's happened in its periphery, countries of Central Asia are gradually shifting away more to have their own independent foreign policies. Some of them are shifting more into working with China. The Caucasus, Russia had to stand by while Armenia and Azerbaijan fought, and has less influence over Azerbaijan than it has since some point in the Russian Empire. Russia has had has had strategic failures in its influence in the Middle East, in Syria, with regard to Iran, not stepping up to back they're not allies, they are aligned friendly states with each other. Venezuela. So in Cuba now, Russia cannot come to Cuba's aid in the way that it once believed it could and did. So, but it can do a lot of splashy things, including increasing action, sabotage in Europe, for example. So it can create problems for the world. China does not want a country with such a long border, shared border, to create those problems for it. So it's looking for ways to maintain that closely aligned relationship without, while also taking advantage of Russia's vulnerabilities for its own economic benefit. So maybe I'll just stop there. Hopefully that's created enough interest for questions. Happy to take questions from the in-person audience as well as those online.
So what? No.
Hello? Okay. Great. Thanks, David. Really appreciate it. One quick question, and then before I go to the audience, I read an article about Starlink and the internet, and Elon Musk owns that company, and so he has a lot of say over who gets internet access and who doesn't. And the article sort of implied recently he took away some internet access from the Russians on the front line, and that had a major impact on Russia's capabilities there. And I was wondering if you could just talk about, what's Elon Musk's take on the war, and what are his alliances and allegiances, and is it weird that this one person can have such a big influence or anything like that?
I'm not going to try to crawl into Elon Musk's brain. That seems kind of scary place to go. Enough scary places outside of it. I don't understand what his motivations are. I think, I'll take whatever, I can get if it's moving done in a positive direction. It has had an impact on Russia's ability to wage the war. They have their own satellites, but they're not nearly as good as Starlink. And so I think it's not a game changer, but anything that makes it harder for Russia to conduct the war in its favor is a good thing. Let me just insert, before we go on to additional questions, one thing that I forgot to say is, what would it take for Putin not to stop conducting the war? What is that what needs to happen? And the only thing that I can think of and have thought of for a while now is if there are enough internal or enough crises, a perfect storm that make him fear that his own ability to his own regime is in jeopardy domestically. And what would those things be? I mentioned the potential for a major banking crisis. If that happens, if the economy collapses, I don't know what that looks like exactly in a place like Russia. But if they lose control over the economy, and so far they haven't really, if that happens, if Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, dies, and he will soon because he's very ill, if there's a succession struggle as a result of that in a region of Russia that has had two wars. Russia has waged two wars to control it. If that happens again, or it spreads to neighboring regions, plus something related to the war, where are they going to get the resources to pull to deal with some other domestic crisis? There's no predicting all of these things, enough of these things happening where he says, I need to pause the war. And it would be a pause in order to deal with these crises. That's the only thing that I can think of that would stop him, if only temporarily. Sorry for that. Sorry.
We'll do one more question here and then the one online. So did you have a question?
Yes. You mostly answered what I was going to ask, but I was wondering, is there any kind of like, if you say the economy is collapsing and whatnot, any kind of like internal pressure from the population of Russia? Do they have any means of, expressing, or does the population of Russia support the war?
Yeah, it's hard to tell with polling. I think probably most Russians do not support the war, but are not going to do anything about it. And we're also seeing growing pressure on the ability to conscript Russians because they can't pay them enough. And if they have to then turn to the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, other large cities, and conscript there, which they've avoided to date. Those are areas, those urban centers, they fear that there's a reason why they haven't forced conscription there, because they're afraid that that concentration of people would create major problems for them that might not be able to manage while also conducting a war. But I don't see anything imminent in terms of the population. I haven't seen anything imminent in terms of the powerful elites, the oligarchs, or the people around Putin, because they all are too invested in his control. They're afraid that they would lose what they have. And he's managed to buy off enough of them that they don't want to rock the boat. And then there's the security services, who are entirely loyal, or probably are not likely to upset the boat either. So you have, societal acquiescence, and then, and the economy we have to wait and see, and then the security services and elites. So those three pillars of upholding the whole system, upholding the regime, have not been shaken.
And I think we have a question online. Let's see, it's highlighted. Thanks. I understand Trump's tariffs were effective recently in pushing India to stop purchasing energy from Russia. If this is true, what effect will this have on Russia's ability to finance the war?
Yeah, I'm not an expert. It gets deeply into the economic aspects, but my understanding is that whether it's sanctions and the effective implementation of sanctions, or individual countries' responses to that pressure, make it more expensive, less efficient, take longer for Russia to get the money that it needs to keep the war going. But the priority for Putin is so high that he insists on finding those. And It's a big country. They have a lot of resources. It gets harder and harder, but he's going to keep going as long as he believes he can, and believes based in part on a sense of timing. Is time on his side? Will Ukraine collapse? Will support for Ukraine collapse enough for him to succeed? But he also is wedded to this project. So, and as far for India, oh, one other part of this is Russia may be losing. This is a downer part of the response. Russia may be losing influence over its traditional aligned partners. And India is kind of, was always neutral, but always had a good relationship with Russia. But what we're seeing in the world today is increasing transactionalism in a multipolar world order. That means that states are looking to, after their own interests, alignments in blocks. There are blocks, but countries want to be in all of the blocks. They're hedging their bets. They're trying to have as many options for themselves as possible. So India might stop buying Russian oil, and it has gone up dramatically. They were at 2% 3 years ago of their imports were from Russia. Then it went up to 20% and higher. But when someone stops looking, they'll start buying again. They may find ways to get around the sanctions that won't incur secondary sanctions on themselves by going through third states, using shadow tankers, etc. And if it's not India, it'll be China and the UAE and Turkey and plenty of other states that were not aligned with Russia before. So.
This is similar to Mark's question. Russia we see these apartment buildings devastated and the electricity. Ukraine has done some stuff inside Russia, splashy things. What is stopping them from attacking apartment complexes in Moscow?
Good question. I would say that they have only so many opportunities to attack Russian targets. So attacking, an apartment building only in Russia could go either way. It could be used to mobilize Russians. They don't want Russians to voluntarily sign up to fight Ukraine because they're being attacked in their, as in their residences. They want, as does Moscow, want Russians to think, oh, what war? I mean, if you're living in cities, it's like Moscow, I haven't been to Moscow in a long time, but what I hear is that people are just living their lives as if there's nothing going on. That's not true in a lot of the regions with high recruits and high casualties, and poorer areas. So that's one reason. The other one, so the potential backlash, which could be negative for Ukraine. The other one is there are lots of military and energy targets in Russia that have a bigger impact. They're focused on the economy, and they're focused on killing as many Russian soldiers as they can. And I think that's more than enough.
Okay, 2 questions. First, I'm wondering, why does Why does Ukraine not recruit men younger than 27 for service? And are there women in their service? I'm also wondering, are there many Ukrainians who would like to be part of Russia, particularly in the Donbass and Crimea and those, contested areas? And I know there's always been a strong identity with the Russian heritage for many, and I'm just curious, are those places divided, amongst their populations?
So on the second part first, my sense is, first of all, we don't have access to surveys of people in the Donbass and in the occupied territories. And there were a lot of people who identified with Russia as Russian speakers, as ethnic Russians in all of the territories that currently and once were under Ukrainian control. But nothing drives people away like really bad Russian behavior. Those occupied territories are terribly run. They're run by thugs. They don't have water. There are a few splashy sort of rebuilding in Mariupol, which was completely demolished, flattened early in the war. They rebuilt this theater, or was it the opera house? I can't remember. But that's not bringing clean water to people or heat. So I don't think there are that many people, certainly in the unoccupied territories, who have much desire to be part of Russia anymore. And then the first part of your question. Oh, right. So I've heard that they did lower it recently to maybe 26 or 25. They don't want to just lose. I mean, both Russia and Ukraine, like many other countries in the world, are declining in population. We're declining without war, without COVID. And Ukrainians don't want to destroy their younger generation. It's a very optimistic, forward-looking view that they're going to get beyond this war. They're going to have a country, and they need people to build it. And you can't just rely on 10-year-olds to do that. So I think that's a big part of it. Plus, as drone warfare, and this was not something probably they were counting on, as drone warfare and operation of drones and drone engineering has increased, they need young people. Young people are probably better equipped to participate that and operate them. I'm not saying that they were all playing video games, and that could be a plus that led to this, but they need them to participate that way. And women are fighting. I don't know what percentage. That's not the case in Russia. They say that women are brought in, but it's more like nurses. They're not in the battlefield as far as I can tell.
There's one more online here. There's actually 22 people online. Ukraine was engaging in splashy attacks inside Russia. Is that still happening? Or if not, or not as much, why has that changed?
It is still happening. It's happening every week. If you're interested, anyone interested, it's covered quite well on both the Ukraine the Latest, that Telegraph daily podcast. Also, you can look at it on the Moscow Times, an English language newspaper that's no longer based in Moscow, but they will cover these. These are assassinations or assassination attempts. They're going after energy infrastructure, oil refineries. And sometimes they have to go after the same ones multiple times because Russia will rebuild them. But it is having an impact on Russia's ability to refine its oil for export. And they're having to increasingly export crude oil abroad to be refined elsewhere, which means that they get less money for it. So it is having an impact on the economy.
So coming back to the question of security guarantees, right? And as you said, obviously that's not going to be NATO, right? That's Hector says so much clearly already, right, in the beginning of his position, right, when he got in. But so what does it, assuming this rosy scenario, something, some magic formula, and they get to an agreement, and could be a prolonged ceasefire, but if security guarantees is an element of that, not being NATO, then what do you see that being, right? It's what kind of guarantee is that behind that, assuming that this has to be an essential part of any concession from Ukraine, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. NATO is not a guarantee. I mean, Article 5 is about, coming together to discuss how to support other NATO members that are under attack. It depends on the will of NATO membership. So I think Russia is eagerly just probing and wanting to test that already, whether Ukraine were to become a member or not. The sabotage attempts in Europe, you have to think about, like, what do NATO members, what are they willing to do against Russia in response to what kind of attack or threat? So it's all unclear. I think Ukraine has increasingly come to the conclusion, its leadership has come to the conclusion that they need to defend themselves in this multipolar world where the US is no longer clearly an ally that they could rely on. Europe is made up of the EU and the UK, made up of many countries, as is NATO membership, with Hungary and Turkey and Slovakia being, difficult in terms of their willingness to stand up to Russia, and they're doing more than being difficult about. I mean, they're cozying up to Russia in different ways. So it's unclear. But I think what we've seen to date is that Moscow does not want to test it so far. They want to undermine NATO. They want to show that NATO is ineffective and is no longer the security organization that it was believed to have, and that it was. I mean, a lot of this has to do with perceptions too. So, anybody who withdraws from NATO, I mean, Russia will be applauding, but they don't want a conventional war between even some NATO members, if they include states like Germany and UK and France, because the Russian military cannot stand up to that. And I mean, I think even Moscow doesn't want to have a nuclear war. They use the nuclear threat to divide the West, to make it afraid that some, at least on the part of some members, oh, we've got to be careful here. We don't want to, trigger that. But I don't think that they're going to want to engage in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I guess following up on your last point there, I was just gonna ask. So I think early on in the war, we heard a little bit more about tactical nukes. And that seems to have gone away, at least somewhat and some of that was about the Ukrainian advance, I think, and some of the other stuff going to Russia, but it seems to have gone away. Is that true? And then following on from that, it seems like that did have an effect on what the Biden administration wanted to do. If you were writing the book, you know, is there things that the Biden administration did well, things that you might do different looking back now that we have a little bit of time since then, I guess?
Yeah, I would have done more sooner. But we didn't, nothing to date led to the use of even tactical nukes. So I think Russia has backed off of those threats. Part of it, I don't know what to think about this, but some people say it's because China, in a rare act of putting pressure on Russia, said, don't talk about this way. But the ending of certain treaties having to do with nuclear weapons is a quieter way that Russia has tried to play that card.
One more online here. I recall there were many protests by Russian families about casualties in Afghanistan. Why are there no similar protests about the Russian casualties in Ukraine?
So I did look into this, I don't know, over a year ago, probably. Those protests did not just come from the ground up. There were occasional protests around the Soviet Union over Afghanistan, but they were put down or just silenced one way or another. It wasn't until after the party Congress in winter of '86, when Gorbachev started indicating that Afghanistan needed to be ended, it was a mistake, and that it started to open up. We had glasnost, we have an opening where people could speak more openly, and then mothers of soldiers and veterans themselves started protesting more. But prior to that, the signal from the top, it really did not take off.
And I wanted one more on this side, so I'm glad you're helping balance the room.
Thank you so much. This has been great. Seems like the UN system is useless in this context because Russia has veto power in the Security Council. And so I guess my question is, what do you think ideally European countries should be doing, as well as the US? It sounds like you were saying that the only hope you see is for a perfect storm to get Putin to stop. So is it trying to create the conditions that can help foster that perfect storm with sanctions, et cetera?
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, the US is not doing nothing now, between private industry, Starlink, and ongoing sanctions, adding more sanctions, as well as the exporting of liquefied natural gas and cracking down on shadow fleets, ships. That is pressure. And if India feels that there are certain kinds of pressure, at least in terms of their private industry, that they don't want their banks, which with any country that has large banks where money is flowing through American systems, as long as those sanctions are in place, they do not want to risk being sanctioned. And that goes for a close partner of Russia, such as China. They're very, very cautious about that, to Russia's great frustration. So all of these economic and political pressures do matter. They don't change Putin's calculus. They don't, they just make it harder. And you know, it's not bringing down the Russian economy, but if there were other stressors on the system, it's important to have these in place. And I think the Europeans also who have been slow to act, although I should say, I just read an article recently, it was in the Wall Street Journal, that Germany, Rheinmetall, which is Germany's largest military company, is producing more artillery shells than the US. And this is curious to me. I don't quite understand it, but how did they step up so quickly? The US kept, you know, the military analysts in and out of government were saying, oh, the US couldn't, the factories could not, even with pushing from the US government, could not actually start producing enough of what was needed until 2028, 29, all these like years in the future. So how did this happen? And it's not just Germany that's producing these things. So Europe is, you know, gradually filling in for what the US and Ukraine is as well. So I'm hopeful that the US will be, even if it plays less a smaller and smaller a role, that others can fill in. And the US is actually pretty behind in drone technology, apparently well behind China and definitely behind Ukraine and behind Russia as well. So it's a growing threat. If Russia does not collapse from all that, whatever collapse means, they're going to be quite experienced with drone warfare, that we need to be taking, and the Europeans need to be taking lessons from the Ukrainians. It's not just a one-way street. Nadine.
Oh, good. I was going to say, our military though is very good at haircuts and beards and things like that.
Yes. Especially now.
Bench presses, bench presses. Thank you, David. This is great. So as you mentioned, Putin sees the collapse of the Soviet Union as, you know, one of the greatest tragedies. So not being optimistic here, if Russia were to win the war, what would be Putin's next step, if we could say that?
So it depends what we mean by winning, and how that winning, I mean, if there's some kind of temporary, or, you know, let's say we get to a peace where there's no fighting along the front lines. Putin may well declare a victory and will be able to spin it domestically for domestic audiences. I mean, quite easily with this vast media propaganda machine that they have. Is that winning? Maybe not according to the rest of the world or the Ukrainians. But for domestic purposes, that could happen until they find a way to, you know, take the next step. I think he will not be satisfied until he gets Kyiv and the government is gone from there. And he may be satisfied with creating just a rump state of Western Ukraine that does not include Kyiv. If that happens, and I don't think that's going to happen, it hasn't happened in 4 years, why would it happen in the next 4? But let's say if that happens, he's going to increasingly, I mean, it's going to depend what's going on in the world and where the US is, where China is, where their economy is. Testing, if NATO is still around at that point, he's going to want to test NATO and even more. Could be actions against Estonia or, you know, Baltic state or Moldova. But there's so many factors that would have to be considered, what's going on. And Russia's economy is not going to be in good shape. So if they get a large part of Ukraine, that can feed their economy. It can feed the, you know, it's an increased population. There's certain benefits that they can get from it, but the cost, I don't know how to weigh the cost benefit of all of that to get to that state, that point of what the world might consider a win by Russia. Sorry, I can't quite answer the question, but.
Let's do one more here and then. Oh, David too. Okay, I'll do this one real quick. You mentioned that overall Ukrainians support the war, wondering how solid that support is. Do you think they'll stay strong in the face of continued casualties and disruptions to their daily life, power outages, food scarcity, etc.?
Well, they have to date. If sabotage and assassinations continue in the occupied territories, they will, I mean, under those conditions, that's a lot worse than what Ukrainians in unoccupied parts of Ukraine are experiencing. They also know that from how Russia has behaved in the occupied areas, what they have done to Ukrainians. They have stolen, kidnapped, abducted thousands, tens of thousands of children. They're going to engage in a cultural genocide, which could only be so extreme after driving Ukrainians away from Russia over the last 30 years. Whether they, it would be terrible, and they know that. You know, their cultural elites, their political elites, their security services, there'll be mass executions. I mean, there's no choice. So they're going to, these bleak conditions. I like to suggest, and it's hardly the perfect analogy, but I read Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile. He's a very readable writer if you've read other books by him. But this is about Churchill and his family and the people around Churchill during the Blitz, before the US got involved in the war, came to their support. And every day, like, it was an up and then it was a down. It was just, and this was a much shorter period of time. And people were, you know, and you see this through Eric Larson's imagining of how Churchill dealt with these things. It's just, I just take it, it's really helpful for me to think about how Ukrainians are dealing with this. Because this is the reality. Yes, they're tired. They don't want this to go on, but the alternative is so much worse. Russia, I mean, just look at what Russia, how they're running water and the corruption in the water and heating and everything, education in the occupied territories. There's no choice.
It's working. Thank you so much for this. It's really, really interesting and valuable. I have a non-Ukraine Russia question, which has to do with nuclear arms, the big nuclear arms. And the treaty, the START treaty has expired. I believe Putin offered to extend it. Trump is not saying. What do you expect going on in the Russian viewpoint on that? And my second question is, aside from the news outlets you've mentioned, what do you rely on for news about Ukraine and Russia?
Okay, let me try to take the second one first. Besides the Moscow Times and the Telegraph, I would say that on the war reporting, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, in London, there's the RUSI, which is the Royal United Services Institute, and then on a whole range of things, but mostly politics and economics in Russia is Carnegie, Moscow, and Berlin. So all of the people who work for the Carnegie Endowment at their branch in Moscow left and relocated in Berlin. And there are lots of really good people, as well as the ones at Carnegie Endowment here in Washington. So yeah, those are all excellent sources. And the ones in Berlin, they're all Russians who are writing about this. On the nuclear thing, what is Putin hoping to accomplish? So being a nuclear power is one of the few things that Putin, Russia can claim, make it a great power in the world. Historically, they go back to the victory in World War II, and they've never stopped talking about that and trotting out the symbolism of that. The Arctic, access to the Arctic and control over a large part of it because of their long northern border is another thing. So between nuclear arms treaties and negotiations and to a lesser extent, Arctic related, these are things, and being on the UN Security Council, these are all things that they still treasure and feel that this puts them up there with the big boys. There's not a lot else that they have at this point to be in the game. And so I think holding out, teasing, the threat, what happens if these treaties end? Then the world will just descend into chaos, so you need us. And so their willingness to play enough to be part of the deserving of their UN Security Council position is very important to them still. And then they have China as a frequent partner in voting, et cetera, on the UN Security Council, but definitely not always. And the other thing is they are worried about China. They're more worried about, well, have been more worried about the US and the West. But with China, I think China has been going it alone. And I think they want to find a way to bring China into the negotiations, into these treaties, so that the US, China, and Russia, atop the world. So any way that they can use these talks and these treaties to be at the big boys table is important to them still.
There's a lot of talk about Putin and surrounding Putin's influence and everything. So as long as you're speculating, what are the possible scenarios either after Putin or instead of? Like, what if something happened to him tomorrow? What's happening behind the scenes politically there.
It's a great.
I thought you were gonna ask me, what does he have on Trump? But,
No, that's some of that.
actually, my answer to that question is, that Trump probably wouldn't care if there were some videotapes from the hotel room. And I mean, there's been so much that he himself has admitted to or said, or that would not, that kind of blackmail would not,
Yeah.
you know, the Epstein files is a whole other thing. And that's, but I won't go there. But to get to your question.
Yeah, oh, okay.
He has not indicated any successor, nor is he likely to, because it would possibly destabilize. There'd be suddenly that shows that he's thinking about after him and sending a signal that people can start positioning themselves for a post-Putin Russia, and he doesn't want to do that. So he likes keeping everybody guessing and not revealing anything like that. I don't know if he even has, he probably, this is just a guess, thinks that nobody can run Russia the way he can. And he knows that there will be an after Putin, but he probably is just trying not to think about that. And he may be around for another 10 years
What
into
if
his early
something-
80s.
Yeah, without his control. That
So let's say
has a
he
stroke
keels
tomorrow.
over
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's hard to know. There could be a power struggle among elites, probably among the security heads of the security services, because they don't want to lose their influence that they've had and bet how they benefited from being under him. But you could have somebody who's a much more extreme nationalist than he is. That's one thing he isn't and he isn't, but it could be worse. And on top of that, you could have whoever comes into power might see that, depending on how they think about China, they might want to find a way to reopen relations, improve relations with the West. So do enough so that those relationships open up again.
Why don't we just finish with the quick one online, and that'll be our last one. And the first question is really short. Have you read Masha Gessen's article today in the New York Times? I haven't. Okay. So sorry, person online, but I'm glad you brought that to our attention. And the next one was about Israel's involvement in the conflict. Is Israel involved at all?
I don't think it's that involved. I was hoping that it might be at some point, but I mean, for Ukraine, but I think they're just trying to balance relations with Russia and Ukraine. On Masha Gessen, just quickly, I haven't read today's article. I've read other things by her. She tends to have a darker view of everything than I do. And I think some of it comes from where she comes from. And perhaps, well, she also writes a lot about the US. So on the war, I think she's probably more accurate than she is on her views of the US, where she probably does not have as much faith or hope in US institutions. I don't know how things are going to go, but as realistically she might, or an appreciation for our history, quite the same. But she's a great writer, great thinker. So.
Thanks again.
Thank you.